2, 1, now. You're set.
Excellent. Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third and final online virtual Q&A session for BuyerFest 2020. Thank you all for being with us today. Just a few items before we get started. We have a few options for asking questions. If you're using your tablet or phone, you can use the chat function to ask question, or you may also raise your hand by clicking the raise your hand button at the bottom, and we'll have the opportunity to ask your questions later. To unmute, if you're on your phone, you may have to hit *6. We just want to make sure. I know there was some technical difficulties last time to get unmuted, so just hit those buttons, or if you're on your tablet or a smartphone, you can always unmute using the button there. And we'll have plenty of time for everyone to get questions in, no problem. And now just a little bit about Chris Currey, who is joining us today. Chris's controlled environment and greenhouse crop research is focused on providing research-based best management practices to support commercial producers of ornamental and food crops to improve productivity and sustainability, using and managing light, temperature, and mineral nutrition and plant growth regulators. The presentation Chris Currey provided is called Finishing Fertilization for Growth and Control and Appearance. This presentation is still available to view on the BuyerFest app, as well as on the Carlin sales website through our YouTube channel. And thanks, Chris, for joining us today.
No problem, Nick. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And one thing I'll just, before I forget, you're going to have this session recorded. You've also got the presentation recorded. Mm-hmm. We've got the PDF of my handout. Mm-hmm. And I believe in that PDF at the end, as those of you who might be consuming these materials later, not live, my email should be in there as well as my office phone. So please feel comfortable to contact me. Now we're on and off campus, so email is a little bit better. But if you have questions, feel free to follow up with my email at ccu@iastate.edu. I just don't want to forget to do that later.
Sure, no problem. So, for those up on the screen, I just put it up on the screen so everyone has it available to take a look at quick. But we'll make sure that this presentation is also available to everyone if they need to look at it at a later time. And then we can get started with some questions.
Cool, awesome.
Chris, we just have a few questions that we received this conversation from some of our customers as well as some of the Carlin employees. So we'll start with those first, and then we'll kind of open up the floor to everyone else.
Okay.
So first question was I see some bags of fertilizer have a water type and such. How important is that, and what is it?
Sure. So there are certain fertilizer companies that have fertilizer formulations that are designed for specific water types. And really, when we're talking about water types, we're really referring to the alkalinity of the water source. Okay, and this is especially true when we're looking at groundwater sources, looking at the source of where that groundwater is coming from. A lot of times we have limestone aquifers. We're going to have higher amounts of alkalinity, that calcium carbonate. So with some of these different fertilizers, they're going to be formulated for waters that have different amount of alkalinity, because when you're looking at alkalinity, generally speaking, you're trying to reduce alkalinity, because alkalinity is the quantitative capacity of water to buffer changes in pH. And if you look at the range of alkalinity from 0 parts per million up to let's say 300 or 400 parts per million, you can have too little, 0 to about 40 parts per million alkalinity. That can be too little, and your water can actually swing too quickly, change pH too quickly. Alternatively, about 40 to 60 to 75 parts per million, that's really good as far as an alkalinity concentration in a water source. You don't need to really think about it, because that alkalinity, you can think of it like liquid limestone. You're not adding a lot to your production, so you're not going to be buffering that change in pH or driving. As your alkalinity starts to climb, however, generally you want to reduce your alkalinity because you want to avoid your pH drifting up. Generally, we're trying to keep our pH between 5.8 or 6.2. Or if we're looking at some spring annuals and some potted plants, they'll require a lower pH, those iron inefficient plants or those micronutrient inefficient plants. So as your alkalinity in your water source starts to get higher, there are a couple of different ways that you can try and change the alkalinity. And one is going to be by acidifying your water, injecting sulfuric acid, nitric acid, phosphoric acid into the system, and that acid neutralizing your alkalinity. But some growers would prefer not to have to work with acidifying their water, whether that's because they don't want to work with the chemical, they don't want to have to add the extra injector, or they just want one less thing to deal with. So coming back to answering this question, you can tell I'm a professor. You can select certain fertilizers that can accommodate different levels of alkalinity by having a more acidifying effect when you add that fertilizer. And Nick, I don't want to. I'm not sure what you prefer. Like, can we name names when we're talking about fertilizers and the water quality? I just want to make sure I'm communicating ethics.
I want to give our customers the best information out there. So if
absolutely. And so Peters, the ICL Peters Excel has got that water quality rating, and I believe it's a water type A, B, and C. I'm not for sure, and so I don't want to mess that up. But they'll classify these water types, and then you can select these different fertilizers for the different water types, and you can have a fertilizer that is going to have relatively little effect on the alkalinity, and that's going to be for those low alkalinity waters where you don't need to change anything, all the way up to fertilizers that are more well suited for water types that have higher amounts of alkalinity, where you are trying to reduce that alkalinity so you can keep your pH down or keep your pH from drifting up. So that's really things, and that's really the components that Peters is putting in the fertilizer itself, because without trying to take away from a subsequent question that may be asked, you also have fertilizers that can be an acidic fertilizer or a basic fertilizer that will affect pH. But this water quality and the corresponding fertilizer, that's more of a proprietary adjustment to the fertilizer formulation to accommodate higher or lower alkalinity water. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Thank you.
Sure.
Next question is, why is ppm nitrogen the standard when determining injector ratios and not phosphorus or potassium?
Yeah, great question. I wish I had a great answer. But I think, aside from it being the macronutrient that's used in the greatest quantities, I think because it's the first number on the bag when you look at an NPK analysis. And we just tend to talk in parts per million nitrogen because so many producers tend to use a one-bag fertilizer mix, whereby we're adjusting that nitrogen ratio to accommodate the nitrogen requirements for the plants. But we know that, just like you're saying, you've also got the phosphorus and the potassium, or calcium and magnesium, that we could talk in terms of parts per million. But when we're talking about fertilizers, I think we tend to use parts per million nitrogen just as the standard, assuming all the other nutrients are provided in fixed proportion. So as we're talking about a one-bag fertilizer mix, and you go from 1 to 200 parts per million, well, clearly you're also doubling the amount of phosphorus and potassium and micronutrient packaging as well. So in some ways, we really could say, going from 1x to 2x fertilizer amount. But we need something, I think, is a more specific goalpost, and that's how nitrogen got that way, or got that important role when we talk about ppm nitrogen. Now, if you start to include a second or a third injector, which I believe is a very simple approach to creating a more nuanced or flexible fertilizer plan, then might be getting away from parts per million nitrogen. For instance, for spring bedding plants, I've used a 4-injector system as a grower, just 4 dosatron injectors. And in one injector, we had 20-0-20 That would be an acidic fertilizer, but no micronutrients. In another, we had a 15015. That's your basic fertilizer, no micronutrients. Then in a separate injector, we injected our phosphorus, and an additional injector, our micronutrient package. So as we decoupled the phosphorus and the micronutrients from the nitrogen and the potassium, then we started talking parts per million phosphorus, because we would adjust our phosphorus concentration based on the crop we were irrigating, whether plug crop, what plug crop it was, or whether it was like a pack crop or a 4.5 inch potted. We would use different phosphorus concentrations to achieve different plant sizes. So then we started talking parts per million phosphorus. But going back to why we say ppmn, I think it's the first number on the bag.
All right.
And some people use fixed fertilizers in one fixed proportion, a one bag mix.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you.
But we can talk about ppms of all the different nutrients. That kind of gets me excited.
Perhaps another presentation, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, right. Another time.
You bet. Next question. What is meant by pH low fertilizers?
Okay. So I think, and I'm trying to recall if this was something specifically that I said in the presentation. I don't think this is referring to so much the water quality based formulations of fertilizers that the first question referred to. I think this might be referring to something I alluded to when I was saying an acidic fertilizer or a basic fertilizer. When you look at the impact, when you fertilize plants with nitrogen, generally that nitrogen is provided to our crops in one of three forms: nitrate nitrogen, ammoniacal nitrogen, or urea nitrogen. Now, we can make this a lot simpler right away by just basically considering urea nitrogen to be ammoniacal nitrogen, because that's what it's going to be converted to in the pot in your growing substrate. So when you provide plants with either nitrate or ammonium, you can have two separate chemical reactions. Plants always need to maintain an electrochemical balance in their plant tissue because they're just little chemical machines. And as the plant takes up a positively charged ammonium ion, that positively charged, that cation, it needs to get rid of something positively charged to maintain the same electrochemical balance. So as it takes, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The positively charged, then it's going to, the positively charged ammonium, then it's going to kick out a proton, an acid, a proton, a hydrogen ion. That lowers our pH. So when plants take up the ammonium fertilizer, NH4 plus, and you can see that when you look at a fertilizer label, that causes the plant to kick out a proton, which ends up reducing the pH. And so when I talk about a low pH fertilizer, acidifying fertilizer, that tends to refer to a fertilizer that has a higher proportion of ammoniacal nitrogen or urea nitrogen. Now, on the flip side, you also have something like a pH up type fertilizer or a basic fertilizer. These are going to be fertilizers that have a higher proportion of nitrate nitrogen. Nitrate is negatively charged, so when it's taken up, the plant will exude a hydroxyl, a negatively charged ion, and that ends up causing the pH to increase. So that's why when you use nitrate-based fertilizers, you tend to see a drift in pH up, whereas acidic fertilizers, you tend to see a drift in pH down. That's that potential acidity or potential basicity of applying the different fertilizers. Now, just in case there's one potential for confusion, there is a specific product in a jug called pH low. That is a liquid concentrate of an acid for hydroponic crops. So in case I just want to make sure that you weren't referring to, and I don't think the question was probably referring to the actual product pH low. That's an acidifying, a solution acidifier. So I'm assuming that the question was about those fertilizers that will reduce the pH, those ammonium-based fertilizers. And that can be a really useful tool in a lot of the country because we tend to, going back to the first question, A lot of the Midwest, lots of parts of the country tend to have higher alkalinity. We tend to be fighting pH drifting up. So using those ammonium-based fertilizers, or those fertilizers that have a higher potential acidity, a higher potential to lower the pH, those can be really useful in production for managing pH.
Excellent, thank you. Now, that was the end of our pre-questions that we received beforehand. So now we'd like to open it up to anyone who's on the call right now. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're on your phone, you may need to hit, I believe, *6 to unmute. Otherwise, if you're on like your smartphone, tablet, watching on Teams or on the internet, you just need to hit the unmute button, which is the microphone. So please, if anyone has any questions, let us know.
I have a question. Am I coming through?
Yep. Loud and clear.
Awesome. Yay. No *6 this time. When talking, we had last week's presentation kind of was about plant growth regulators. And one of the things, of course, to regulate plant growth is going to be temperature, daylight, light in general, fertility, all of that type of, many, many different factors, humidity. What types of fertilizer, PGR interactions are there? I mean, so different types of nitrogen are going to cause different things, but if you could touch on that a little bit about, oftentimes we are hitting things with fertilizer and then we're putting the brakes on, and then we're hitting the gas, and then we're putting the brakes on.
You're using both feet like my grandpa used to do.
Yes. So how
sure.
Better
so a little bit. I think that there's the potential to moderate the use of both fertilizer and plant growth regulator. I think that, and let me be clear when I say that, I'm not trying to say that either should be eliminated. Traditionally speaking, it's very easy to avoid nutrient deficiencies by providing excessive fertilization through water-soluble fertilizers. Then we can also use plant growth regulators to combat the excessive growth from the excessive application of fertilizer. I don't think that's the best approach, because that's more fertilizer, more PGR, and more labor, more management decisions. I think that a better approach to take is trying to moderate all things. So drawing back our fertilizer concentrations, how much fertilizer we apply. That's, I think, the number one thing that we can look at. I think we generally overfeed, and I think that point was made in the presentation. And again, I think we generally overfeed because historically, fertilizer is not the most expensive part of production, and so it's easy to maintain a good-looking crop by fertilizing. So I understand why. It's a cheap insurance policy. But I think that everyone's skill set has advanced, products have advanced, fertilizers, plant materials, substrates, everything is advanced. So I think that we can start to grow with fewer inputs. And I think that that's also kind of the sustainable path that we're looking for, both for the bottom line of the business and for the environment. So I think on our overall fertility rates, going back to the previous question, taking that ppm nitrogen down from maybe 200 to 100, 150 down to 100. I think that there's possibilities to go low. I think you can also go lower with your water-soluble fertilizer and potentially incorporate a low base level of controlled release fertilizer. So here you're starting to moderate your risks in fertilization too. By adding a little bit of base feed using a controlled release fertilizer, you're going to have fertility provided to those plants even on the days when you can't irrigate due to cloudy, overcast weather in the spring. So you can maintain fertility. Then you can come in and plants as needed with additional fertilizer, water-soluble fertilizers, to either boost growth, boost color, whatever you're looking to do. But the good thing is that controlled release fertilizers tend not to push plant growth as much as water-soluble fertilizers. It just doesn't cause as much, I don't want to say excessive growth, but it's a more toned growth. So that's something you can get. Now, I also think that there's a good place for plant growth regulators because you can help tone up plants really well using plant growth regulators. So maybe you're not trying to control excessive growth resulting from excessive fertilization, but you can tone your plants. You can get thicker leaves. You can get darker green leaves because those leaves are a little bit more compact. You can still tighten up plants. You can produce them at a higher density in your greenhouse, more units per square foot, by using some PGRs. Now, if you want to talk a little bit more nuance about plant growth regulators, I think what we talk about the interaction of fertilizers and plant growth regulators is we can specifically target phosphorus. If you're willing to take a fertilizer that has a low phosphorus concentration or no phosphorus and maybe potentially use a second injector to provide phosphorus, tweaking your phosphorus concentration during the seedling plug production phase and during the finishing phase, and I'm talking primarily about your spring herbaceous annuals, can really control some stem elongation. Some species are less susceptible to low phosphorus elongation control, but they still look good even under lower phosphorus concentrations. Perennials, it's a little bit harder to get the growth control out of perennials using low fertilizer, especially for those second-year perennials where you're using a vernalized plug or a crown. There's lots of phosphorus stored in that plug. But if we specifically use lower nitrogen rates, specifically use lower phosphorus rates, then we can start to look at those PGRs that can help us tone our plant. Those are going to be those PGRs maybe with less residual activity, like your diminizide or maybe your ansiminol. So we can tone our plants up. You can have that short period of growth control for keeping them marketable and transportable in your racks, but then they grow out for the consumer more quickly. Again, when you go back to that high fertilizer rate, high nitrogen rate, excessive growth, then having to use lots of PGR, I fear that sometimes overgrowth regulating in the greenhouse, and that's potentially limiting the growth potential of plants once they get out in the garden. And ultimately, we want things to go nuts in the gardens because we want our consumers to have a good time. You know, that's why Proven Winners material does so well. It thrives in the garden. It can be a real bear to grow in a container, but it's bred for landscape performance. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but I'd like to see us back off of nitrogen and phosphorus, but still keep PGRs in your arsenal. Maybe back away from the higher concentrations, but still be able to use them to control toning. And those are mostly PGRs for growth control. I think there are a whole lot of other opportunities when we look at other growth regulators for branching, but this is just keeping it within growth control. Is the caller still on the line?
I still am, yes, and that does help. You know, you did answer the question. I guess that brings up another question is,
Please, let's go.
You know, 2020 is like talked about as the general purpose, all purpose.
Talk about the year 2020, because I know we're all talking about 2020, and I just don't want to mix it up with the fertilizer. You're
No,
talking
the fertilizer, yes, the fertilizer.
Has no place in production horticulture.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Triple 20 has no place in production horticulture. I think it's got way too much phosphorus.
That was my next question, is does it overdo it? Does it really overdo it, and you can actually get away with something more like a 13-2-13 or something?
Absolutely. I wasn't trying to get you off. It's just you're kind of getting me excited, and I could see where you were going. And triple 20 is a fine fertilizer for other purposes, but it pushes growth too much. 20 is absolutely sufficient. 21-5-17, 13-2-13. My personal favorite, because I am a nerd, is a phosphorus-free fertilizer and then a monopotassium phosphate tank on a separate injector. Because I can feed my plugs with my 15-0-15 phosphorus-free, and then I can juice some of the finished stuff and add some phosphorus back in there. Phosphorus responses will saturate, and that's going to be somewhere, it really depends, but if I were going to generalize, if you're providing any more than 30 or 40 parts per million phosphorus, that has no effect on flower formation or flower buds or the vegetative growth. That's strictly leaching out and going down the drain. Phosphorus responses are very much saturated easily by 30 and 40 parts per million. And so if you think about it with triple 20, if you're feeding 150 parts per million nitrogen, you're also feeding 150 parts per million phosphorus. That's over 3 times the amount that you're well past the saturation. So that's where you say those lower phosphorus formulations, the 213, when you calculate out the phosphorus that you're getting based on the ppm nitrogen you're providing, you'll see you're providing adequate phosphorus, and you could probably even provide less in some cases.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Did that follow up and answer that additional question on phosphorus?
That it did.
Cool. Great. Now, one thing I will say, one risk that you do run anytime we're talking about low nutrients, and I'm all about low macronutrients, but be mindful of your micronutrients. When you start getting into that 50 parts per million nitrogen, 75 ppm nitrogen, 100 parts per million nitrogen, keep in mind your micronutrient package. You might not be providing enough micronutrient, especially for some of these vegetative annuals. We're reducing our nitrogen and our phosphorus to control vegetative growth, but we need those micronutrients to keep our plants green. So this is where you want to look at some of those boosted base formulations, or potentially just like a micronutrient package to supplement to make sure you keep your plants green. We back off on nitrogen and phosphorus for size, but we want to be mindful of micros to keep that good appearance. Especially with a lot of our new vegetative annuals, they tend to be those low pH crops, which means they like lots of micronutrients. And so when we start doing low feed to control vegetative growth, sometimes we may be providing too little micronutrient. So that's why you want to try and, again, use something with a higher amount of micronutrients, like some of the boosted base or the FEE, the feeds, or just use a supplemental micro package to keep them green. That's just a caveat to low nitrogen approaches, especially as so many people use a one bag approach. I think I can take another question.
Yeah, anyone else have anything else they'd like to ask Chris here?
Does our caller on the line have another question?
I always have another question. I just don't want to take up airtime.
No, please do.
Yeah,
I'm here.
Okay. All right. Here's another one for you. We're going to talk bedding plant production, 4.5-inch, 10-inch baskets of impatiens, kind of. So
which impatiens?
Soluble salt.
Bedding impatiens or sun patiens?
New Guinea.
Impatiens? New Guineas. Okay, cool. Yeah.
New Guinea. So sometimes we see that they are not taking off, and we oftentimes blame heat and or coolness and dampness to that. How much of that could be soluble salts building up? Is that a concern with certain floricultural crops? I mean, that's one that I remember from my training that was very sensitive to that. But are there others too that we could point to, and we're not generally thinking it could be that? We might even be doing more damage by adding more fertilizer to encourage it.
You would be. Okay, so let's just stick with New Guinea impatiens. And you're talking about their establishment.
Yes.
So when you're transplanting, getting them transplanted, and you want to see them, you're talking about trying to improve their establishment until they take off. So
correct.
There's a couple
Correct.
Okay, so and you already hinted at the 3 things that I would be cautious about. 1, New Guineas are absolutely sensitive to fertilizer salts. They don't need any fertilizer when they get transplanted. You can transplant them, and they can go 1 or 2 weeks with no fertilizer, no problem. No problem. New Guineas are absolutely sensitive to high EC, and especially during transplanting. You also want to be mindful of the temperature. Anytime during production from rooting, transplanting, flower development, they're a warm growing crop. So the cold temperatures can stall New Guineas. Absolutely. That can stall them from rooting out into your 4-inch, 4.5-inch, and your 10-inch baskets. It can also slow them from developing flower buds. They're a warm growing crop. The third thing you mentioned is moisture. Now this is where it gets interesting and maybe comes back specifically to, again, your establishment period. New Guinea impatiens are heavy drinkers. They like a lot of water. One of the things that you can do later in production to control New Guinea impatiens growth is to just grow them not as wet as they could drink, because that'll help control some of the growth. But when you transplant New Guinea impatiens, it's actually better to keep them not wet, not soaked, a little bit on the, I don't know if I want to say drier side, but pretty close to that dry side at transplanting for the first week or two. That's an interesting fact, especially since New Guineas are such a water-loving crop. Like I said, I know them as a heavy drinking crop. But growing them on the drier side for the first 7 to 14 days after transplant can improve the establishment. So give the New Guineas as much heat as you can afford giving them. Do not overwater them or grow them wet early on during production. That can slow down their establishment into the pot. And for fertilization throughout production, they're going to be a low feeding crop, but you don't need to worry about getting fertilizer on them during that first week or two during production, especially if they had some fertilizer application during the rooting phase. How does that address what you were asking?
Well, it addresses it directly, because I think sometimes we look at New Guineas and they tend to cycle real bad in the greenhouse, and we just continue to feed them. And I think it's coming back to, we overdo it with fertilization initially, and
Yes.
we stunt them and don't give them an opportunity to put down quote unquote good roots. And then we're playing catch up with that crop in particular, because we think, we have to feed these heavy for flowering, but that's later on to break that cycling sometimes you get.
And even then, they are not a heavy feeding crop. I think, every time I see good-looking New Guinea impatiens and I ask the fertilizer concentration, I always get a little bit shocked at how low they go. Without trying to be a shameless self-promoter, in Greenhouse Management Magazine, in the production pointer column that I write, I think it was this past spring. I can't remember what month, but if you still got Greenhouse Management Magazine, or you can probably Google it. I did a production pointer on New Guinea impatiens, and so it goes all through these pointers from transplanting all the way to, I think, flowering, and it highlights the points that you're talking about and the points that I brought up. So just if you want an additional reference, maybe some greater detail, that would be an additional resource, but it lays out everything, pointers for New Guinea impatiens.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. I'd be curious, and please, as a greenhouse extension agent, I get to try and offer solutions. If you do change your approach to your New Guinea impatiens this year, and you fertilize them less during transplant, and you have better establishment, please let me know. I would love to hear any successes or anything you changed but it didn't help. I'd love to hear some feedback, especially just because, like I said, I was talking about this earlier this year, so I'd love to hear how that works out for you. I offer no refunds, though. I'll just be fair and let you know that.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Yep.
Excellent. Any other questions for Chris? Anyone have anything else? I did find that article right away, right here, just by Googling Greenhouse Management Magazine, Chris Currey, New Guinea impatiens. So that's what I typed into Google, and this was the first link here. So if you're on your computer watching the presentation, I have the article up right now. Otherwise, later on, feel free to type in those keywords, and you'll be able to find the entire presentation.
Yeah, and that's got that sort of goes into a little bit more depth into those tips that I was just outlining.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else for Chris today? Okay, if not, we can wrap up at this time. I would want to thank everyone, including Chris here, for coming in and virtually answering some questions for everyone. Like I mentioned earlier, this will be recorded, so we will have this presentation available to everyone afterwards. And please feel free to check it out later. Chris, thank you again. And we had your contact information up, but we'll make sure to include it with everything again.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
You bet. Thank you, everyone.